The avoidant disappeared weeks or months ago with finality that suggested permanent ending. They created absolute distance, maintained complete silence, gave every indication that they had moved on, and closed the chapter on whatever connection existed between you. The absence felt total, the message clear, the closure implied if not explicitly stated. You adjusted to their non-existence in your life, built routines that did not include them, learned to function without the person who once occupied significant psychological space despite never being fully emotionally available while present. Then, they return. Not with fanfare or dramatic gesture. Not with apology that acknowledges the harm their disappearance caused. Not with evidence that anything fundamental has changed about their capacity for sustained intimacy. They return casually, almost as though the extended silence was brief and inconsequential, as though you should be receptive to reconnection without requiring accountability for the abandonment their withdrawal created. The return itself feels presumptuous, entitled, like they assume your availability despite providing no explanation for their absence or justification for their reappearance beyond the fact that they have chosen to reach out. What happens when the avoidant finally faces you after long silence is not unique or unpredictable. The same patterns emerge every single time regardless of the specific avoidant or the particular circumstances of the silence. These patterns are driven by the avoidant's core psychological needs that have nothing to do with genuine desire for relationship and everything to do with managing their own internal state, restoring specific functions your presence provided, addressing wounds your absence activated. Understanding what happens every single time the avoidant faces you after silence is essential for protecting yourself from re-engaging with someone whose return is not about transformed capacity for intimacy, but about their unchanged need for what you provided without the costs genuine relationship requires. The avoidant's approach when facing you after long silence reveals their actual intentions more clearly than any words they speak or promises they make. The way they initiate contact, the tone they adopt, the accountability they take or avoid, the vulnerability they demonstrate or withhold, the expectations they communicate about how reconnection should proceed. All of it shows you whether the silence created space for genuine transformation, or simply gave them enough distance that approaching you feels manageable again, despite nothing about their patterns having changed. The predictable sequence of what happens tells you everything you need to know about whether the avoidant is worth reconsidering or whether their return is just another cycle in the pattern that made their absence necessary in the first place. Number 1. They approach as though the silence was mutual decision rather than abandonment they chose. The avoidant almost never acknowledges that they created the silence unilaterally, that their withdrawal was choice they made without your agreement or input, that the extended absence was abandonment rather than mutually decided break. Instead, they frame the silence as something that happened to both of you, as natural outcome of circumstances, as space that was needed without specifying who needed it or why. They use language that obscures their agency in creating the distance. Phrases like, "we needed time apart," or "things got complicated," or "life got busy," that distribute responsibility for the silence rather than owning that they chose to disappear. This framing serves crucial psychological function for the avoidant. It allows them to return without taking accountability for the harm their abandonment caused, without acknowledging that they made active choice to cut off contact, without facing that their disappearance communicated to you that you were not worth maintaining connection with, despite whatever feelings they claimed to have. The mutual framing protects them from having to sit with guilt about abandoning someone who mattered, from recognizing that their patterns are destructive rather than just complicated, from understanding that silence they initiated was not neutral space but active rejection that damaged trust in ways simple reconnection cannot repair. Subscribe to understand why avoidants rewrite the history of their own abandonment to avoid the accountability genuine reunion requires. The avoidant needs you to accept this framing, because accepting it allows reconnection to proceed without the difficult conversations that genuine accountability demands. If the silence was mutual, then no apology is needed. If the distance was circumstantial rather than chosen, then they bear no responsibility for the hurt it caused. If the absence just happened, rather than being their deliberate withdrawal, then you have no legitimate grievance requiring them to make amends or explain themselves. The framing eliminates all the work genuine repair would require, allowing the avoidant to restore connection without having to be vulnerable about why they left or what has changed that makes their return anything other than temporary respite before they withdraw again. When you refuse to accept this framing, when you name clearly that they chose the silence and that their choice to disappear without explanation was abandonment requiring accountability, the avoidant is confronted with reality they worked hard to obscure. Many will become defensive, suggesting that you are being dramatic or holding grudges, that you should be mature enough to move past what happened rather than dwelling on it. This defensiveness reveals that the avoidant has done no genuine work on understanding their patterns, that they are returning without having addressed whatever made them leave, that they expect you to accommodate their inability to take responsibility, just as you accommodated their inability to show up consistently before they disappeared. The avoidant who has done genuine work approaches differently. They take full ownership of the silence, acknowledging without defensiveness that they chose to withdraw, that their choice caused harm regardless of their intentions, that the absence was their creation, rather than mutual decision or unavoidable circumstance. They do not expect you to minimize the impact of their abandonment, or pretend the silence was less significant than it was. They understand that returning after choosing to disappear requires humility and accountability, rather than casual resumption of connection as though nothing damaging occurred. But most avoidants never approach this way. They return with the mutual framing intact, expecting you to participate in the fiction that the silence just happened, counting on your desire for reconnection to override your need for accountability. Your willingness to accept or reject this framing determines whether you re-enter the same dynamic that made their disappearance inevitable, or whether you maintain standards that require them to actually address their patterns before being given access to you again. Number 2, they test your emotional state to determine how much power they have in the dynamic. Before committing to genuine reconnection, the avoidant almost always engages in testing behavior designed to assess your emotional state and determine whether you are still invested enough that they can maintain control of the dynamic. They send casual message to see how quickly you respond. Make ambiguous statement to gauge whether you seek clarification. Mention vague difficulty to assess whether you offer support without them having to directly ask. Each interaction is information gathering mission, determining how much you still care, how available you remain despite their absence, how much power they have based on your continued investment. The avoidant needs this information because their sense of safety in relationship depends on believing they care less than you do, that they could lose you without being devastated while losing them would destroy you, that the power imbalance protects them from the vulnerability of needing someone who might leave. If you respond immediately to their casual contact, they learn they still matter enough to interrupt your life. If you seek clarification about their ambiguous statements, they learn you are still invested in understanding them. If you offer support for difficulties they mention vaguely, they learn you are still willing to provide emotional labor without reciprocity. The testing reveals the avoidant's true intentions in facing you after silence. If they were returning because they had done genuine work and developed capacity for intimacy, they would not need to test your emotional state. They would be prepared to pursue you regardless of how available or invested you appear to be. The testing proves they are returning strategically rather than from genuine readiness for relationship, that they need confirmation you are still weak enough to control before they commit to reconnection, that their approach is calculated assessment of whether you will accept them back on terms that require nothing vulnerable from them. When you respond to the testing with strength, delayed responses, refusal to seek clarification about intentional ambiguity, boundaries around providing support without reciprocal investment, The avoidant receives information that destabilizes their confidence about approaching you. They discover that the silence did not preserve your availability, that you have moved on enough that their return is not automatically welcomed, that you may no longer be willing to accept relationship on terms that require your self-abandonment. This discovery often causes the avoidant to retreat again, confirming that their interest in facing you was conditional on you still being weak enough to control. But occasionally, the avoidant who discovers you are no longer available in the ways you were before their disappearance responds by increasing their effort, by pursuing more directly, by demonstrating investment they were incapable of showing before they left. This increased effort can feel validating, like evidence that your strength has made them recognize your value and choose to show up differently. But the effort must be examined critically because it is often strategic, pursuit designed to restore their control, rather than evidence of genuine transformation that will be sustainable once they feel secure that you are not going anywhere. The avoidant who has genuinely transformed does not engage in testing because they understand that their return after choosing silence requires them to demonstrate changed capacity, regardless of your emotional state. They pursue with consistency that does not depend on receiving immediate, positive responses. They communicate directly rather than through ambiguous statements designed to gauge your investment. They offer support without waiting to see if you will provide it first. The transformed avoidant knows they have work to do to rebuild trust their absence destroyed, and they approach that work with humility rather than treating your continued availability as assumption they can test to confirm. Number 3. They expect immediate intimacy without having to rebuild trust their abandonment destroyed. The avoidant facing you after long silence often approaches reconnection, as though the relationship should resume at the level of intimacy that existed before they disappeared, as though the silence created no damage requiring repair, as though trust that took months or years to build can be instantly restored without them having to do the work rebuilding requires. They want to skip past the awkwardness of reestablishing connection, want to avoid the vulnerability of acknowledging how their abandonment affected you, want to return to familiar intimacy without having to sit with the discomfort of being strangers made strange by the distance their choice created. This expectation reveals the avoidant's fundamental misunderstanding of how trust functions in relationship. Trust is not binary state that exists or does not exist. It is continuous construction, built through consistent behavior over time, damaged by betrayal or abandonment, requiring patient repair when broken. The avoidant's disappearance without explanation was betrayal of whatever trust existed. Their silence communicated that you were not worth maintaining connection with. Their absence proved they could abandon you completely when relationship became uncomfortable. This betrayal destroyed trust in ways that cannot be repaired by simply showing up again and expecting things to continue where they left off. The avoidant wants immediate intimacy because rebuilding trust slowly would require them to sustain consistent presence through the awkward early stages of reconnection, to tolerate discomfort of you being guarded while they prove through actions that they will not abandon you again, to sit with uncertainty about whether you will ever fully trust them again, even if they do everything right. The avoidant's nervous system cannot tolerate this level of uncertainty and discomfort, cannot sustain the consistent effort that rebuilding requires, cannot risk the vulnerability of pursuing someone who may ultimately decide they are not worth the risk of retrusting. So instead of accepting that trust must be rebuilt slowly, the avoidant pushes for immediate intimacy that bypasses the repair process entirely. They suggest meeting up as though months of silence were brief interruption. They reference inside jokes or shared history as though that history entitles them to access. They have not earned back. They communicated expectations for emotional availability from you while offering nothing equivalent themselves. They want the benefits of intimacy that trust enables without doing the work that rebuilding trust demands. When you refuse to provide immediate intimacy, when you maintain appropriate distance that reflects the current state of broken trust rather than the historical intimacy that existed before they disappeared, the avoidant often becomes frustrated or hurt. They frame your guardedness as punishment, your appropriate boundaries as you being cold or unforgiving, your requirement that they rebuild trust as evidence you never really cared or you would be willing to move past what happened. This framing is manipulation, designed to guilt you into dropping boundaries that protect you from re-engaging at level of vulnerability they have not earned access to through their behavior since returning. The avoidant who has done genuine work understands that immediate intimacy is not reasonable expectation after choosing to disappear. They accept that trust must be rebuilt slowly, that you have every right to be guarded until their consistent behavior over time proves they will not abandon you again, that the intimacy they want is on the other side of patient work rebuilding, rather than something they can expect simply because they returned. They approach reconnection with humility about the damage their absence caused and willingness to do whatever repair requires without demanding you make it easy for them, by pretending the abandonment was less significant than it was. Number 4, they provide explanations for the silence that minimize their agency and avoid genuine accountability. When pressed to explain why they disappeared, the avoidant almost always provides narrative that minimizes their choice and agency in creating the silence. They were overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. They needed space to deal with personal issues. They were protecting you from their problems. They did not know how to communicate what they were feeling, so they withdrew instead. The explanations framed the silence as something they were compelled to do rather than choice they made, as protective or necessary, rather than abandonment driven by their inability to tolerate intimacy, as understandable response to difficulty rather than revealing pattern of how they manage relationship discomfort. These explanations serve to maintain the avoidant's self-image as reasonable person, dealing with complicated circumstances rather than person with severe attachment, dysfunction, who abandons people when intimacy triggers their defenses. They need you to accept explanations that preserve their ego, that allow them to continue believing their patterns are justified responses to life difficulties rather than destructive behaviors requiring therapeutic intervention. The explanations are designed to generate your empathy and understanding rather than your recognition that their patterns are the problem, regardless of what circumstances triggered them. The avoidance explanations also function to prevent you from establishing appropriate boundaries about their behavior. If they were overwhelmed by circumstances, then asking them not to abandon you again when they feel overwhelmed seems unreasonable because you would be requiring them to manage impossible situations differently. If they needed space for personal issues, then establishing that future space needs to be communicated rather than enacted through disappearance seems controlling, because you would be dictating how they handle their own struggles. The explanations frame your very reasonable requirement that they not abandon you as you being unsupportive or not understanding how difficult their life is. But the explanations always obscure the actual truth. The avoidant left because intimacy with you activated their attachment wounds, and their only coping mechanism for that activation is creating distance until the anxiety settles enough that approaching you feels manageable again. The circumstances or personal issues they cite were not actually what drove the silence. Those were simply the content their abandonment wound attached to when intimacy triggered their defensive system. The avoidant could have communicated about being overwhelmed, could have asked for space while maintaining connection, could have let you support them through difficulties instead of disappearing. They chose silence because their psychology cannot tolerate the vulnerability that staying present through discomfort would have required. When you refuse to accept explanations that minimize their agency, when you name clearly that, regardless of circumstances, they chose to abandon you without communication, and that choice reveals their patterns, rather than being justified by whatever they were dealing with, the avoidant must face the reality their explanations were designed to obscure. Most become defensive or angry, accusing you of being harsh or unforgiving, suggesting that you are making their struggles about you, implying that you lack compassion for how difficult their circumstances were. This defensiveness confirms they have done no genuine work on their patterns, and they are expecting you to accommodate their inability to take accountability. The avoidant, who has genuinely worked on themselves, takes full responsibility for choosing silence, regardless of what they were dealing with at the time. They acknowledge that difficult circumstances did not force them to disappear, that they had choices about how to manage their struggles, and they chose the option that hurt you rather than the option that would have required them to be vulnerable. They understand their explanations are not justifications. That context does not erase the damage their choice caused. That what they were dealing with is a separate question from how they chose to handle it, and their handling was destructive, regardless of how difficult the underlying circumstances were. Number 5. They avoid discussing what has changed that would prevent the pattern from repeating. The avoidant facing you after silence almost never voluntarily addresses the critical question: what has actually changed about their capacity for intimacy that would prevent them from disappearing again when relationship triggers the same discomfort that drove their previous abandonment? They focus on their desire to reconnect, on how much they missed you, on their regret about how things ended, but they meticulously avoid examining or discussing what work they have done that would make their return anything other than temporary reprieve before the next cycle of withdrawal. This avoidance is strategic because honest discussion of what has changed would require the avoidant to admit that nothing has changed, that they have done no therapeutic work addressing their attachment wounds, that they are returning with the same limited capacity for intimacy that made their disappearance inevitable last time. The avoidant cannot acknowledge this reality without facing that their return is selfish and potentially harmful, that they are asking you to risk being abandoned again without them having done anything that would reduce the likelihood of that abandonment occurring. The avoidant hopes that avoiding discussion of what has changed will allow reconnection to proceed based on feelings and history, rather than realistic assessment of whether they are actually capable of showing up differently. They want you to be moved by their expressions of missing you, to be swayed by their stated regret, to accept their return based on the emotional pull of reconnection, rather than requiring evidence that they can sustain presence this time when they could not sustain it before. When you directly ask what has changed, what work they have done, what is different now that would prevent the same pattern from repeating, the avoidant typically provides vague generalities that sound meaningful but commit to nothing specific. They have had time to think. They understand themselves better now. They realize what they want. They know what matters. None of these statements indicate genuine transformation, because none of them reference actual behavioral change, therapeutic work, or development of specific capacity they previously lacked. The avoidant, who has genuinely changed, can answer the question of what has changed with painful specificity. They have been in therapy for a specific duration, addressing specific attachment wounds. They can name patterns they have worked to change and describe behavioral evidence of that change. They understand what triggers their defensive withdrawal, and they have developed specific alternative responses they have practiced and can demonstrate. They acknowledge that change is an ongoing process, requiring continued work rather than completed achievement that guarantees they will never struggle again. But most avoidants cannot provide this answer because they have not done this work. They are returning not because they developed capacity to sustain intimacy, but because the discomfort of your absence exceeded the discomfort of approaching you. Because whatever they were avoiding by disappearing is now manageable enough that facing you feels possible. Because their nervous system has regulated enough in the distance that closeness feels tolerable again until it does not, and they need to create space again. Your willingness to reconnect without requiring specific answer to what has changed is your willingness to participate in cycle that will repeat until you enforce boundaries that demand genuine transformation. The avoidant who cannot tell you what has changed is telling you clearly that nothing has changed, and believing their expressions of desire to reconnect while ignoring their inability to identify what would make reconnection sustainable is choosing hope over information that would protect you from being abandoned again. Number 6. They frame your hesitation about reconnecting as the primary obstacle rather than their patterns being the actual problem. when you express reasonable caution about reconnecting with someone who abandoned you, when you establish boundaries that reflect the broken trust their silence created, when you require evidence of change before allowing them full access to you again. The avoidant almost always reframes your protective hesitation as the main problem preventing relationship from working. They suggest that if you would just give them a chance, if you were not so guarded, if you could move past what happened, the relationship could be what it should be. Your caution becomes the obstacle rather than their patterns being the actual barrier to sustainable intimacy. This reframing serves critical function for the avoidant's ego and defensive system. It allows them to avoid accountability by making you responsible for whether reconnection succeeds or fails. If the relationship does not work out, it is because you could not get past their mistake, rather than because they are incapable of sustaining the intimacy relationship requires. If you maintain distance, it is because you are unforgiving, rather than because they have given you no evidence they will not abandon you again. Your appropriate protection of yourself becomes character flaw, preventing intimacy rather than necessary response to their demonstrated unreliability. The reframing also functions to pressure you into lowering your boundaries by making those boundaries seem like the problem. If your hesitation is what prevents the relationship from working, then being a good partner requires setting aside your caution and trusting them, despite their history. If your guardedness is the obstacle, then showing you really care means being vulnerable, even though they have not earned that vulnerability through consistent behavior. The frame makes your self-protection into selfishness, your boundaries into barriers, your very reasonable unwillingness to be re-abandoned into the reason the relationship cannot succeed. But the truth the reframing obscures is that your hesitation is not obstacle to relationship working. It is appropriate response to someone who has demonstrated they cannot sustain intimacy without abandoning you when it becomes uncomfortable. The obstacle to relationship working is their unchanged capacity, their unaddressed patterns, their unwillingness to do genuine work that would make their presence sustainable. Your hesitation is not preventing intimacy. Their inability to show up consistently is preventing intimacy, and your hesitation is simply recognition of that reality. When you refuse to accept the reframing, when you maintain that your caution is protective response to their behavior rather than character flaw preventing connection, when you keep focus on their patterns being the actual problem, requiring their work to address, the avoidant is forced to confront reality they attempted to obscure. Many will become more insistent on the reframing, arguing that everyone deserves second chances, that you cannot build intimacy while being guarded, that your unwillingness to be fully vulnerable proves you are as defended as they are. This insistence reveals their investment in making you the problem, because making you the problem allows them to avoid being the problem. The avoidant who has done genuine work does not engage in this reframing. They understand that your hesitation is earned through their behavior, that your boundaries are appropriate protection rather than obstacles they need to overcome, that your guardedness is their responsibility to address through consistent demonstration of changed capacity rather than your responsibility to drop based on nothing but their desire for you to trust them again. They accept that rebuilding trust means accepting your hesitation and working within it, rather than demanding you eliminate it to make reconnection easier for them. Number 7. They demonstrate through their expectations that they learned nothing from the silence about what relationship with them actually requires. The ultimate revelation of whether the avoidance return after silence represents genuine transformation, or simple repetition of patterns is visible in their expectations about how reconnection should proceed. The avoidant who has learned nothing expects you to accommodate the same limitations that made their disappearance inevitable, expects you to accept inconsistent communication, to tolerate their need for excessive space, to make allowances for their difficulty with emotional availability, to essentially recreate the exact dynamic that ended with them abandoning you because that dynamic became too uncomfortable for them to sustain. These expectations prove that the silence taught them nothing about their patterns, that the distance did not create space for genuine reflection on what they need to change. That they are returning hoping to restore exactly what failed before while somehow expecting different results. The avoidant believes the problem was not the dynamic itself, but something about the specific circumstances or timing. And they return thinking that simply trying again under slightly different conditions will make relationship work this time, despite their capacity being unchanged. The expectations reveal themselves in what the avoidant asks for and what they assume you will provide. They ask for patience with their difficulty communicating, for understanding about their need for space, for acceptance of their limitations around emotional availability. All the same accommodations you provided before that enabled them to avoid addressing their patterns. They assume you will continue doing the emotional labor of maintaining connection, will continue pursuing them through their withdrawal, will continue accepting breadcrumbs of intimacy while they maintain the control that makes relationship feel safe enough for them to continue attempting. When you refuse to provide these accommodations, when you establish that reconnection requires them to meet you with consistent communication and genuine emotional availability, rather than you accommodating their limitations. When you make clear that you will not recreate dynamic where you do all the work, the avoidant is confronted with the reality that reconnecting on healthy terms requires them to show up in ways they have never shown up before. Most will retreat at this point, confirming that their return was contingent on you being willing to enable their avoidance, rather than being motivated by genuine readiness to do the work sustainable relationship demands. The avoidant who has genuinely learned from the silence approaches with completely different expectations. They expect to have to prove themselves through consistent behavior over time. They expect you to have boundaries that reflect the damage their abandonment caused. They expect to do the work of rebuilding trust rather than you making it easy by pretending their absence was less damaging than it was. They understand that relationship with them requires their growth and change rather than your continued accommodation. And they demonstrate readiness for that growth through accepting your boundaries and working within them rather than asking you to lower them. What happens? Every single time reveals what you need to know. The predictable patterns that emerge when avoidant faces you after long silence are not evidence of deep feelings they struggle to express or complicated circumstances that make intimacy difficult. They are evidence of someone whose psychology is organized around avoiding vulnerability, whose defensive system requires control to feel safe, whose capacity for intimacy is severely limited without genuine therapeutic work they almost certainly have not done. The patterns repeat every single time because they are driven by the avoidant's unchanging attachment wounds, rather than by the specific circumstances of any particular relationship or silence. Understanding what happens every single time protects you from interpreting the avoidance return as more meaningful than it actually is, from hoping that this time will be different when all of the evidence suggests it will be exactly the same, from re-engaging with someone who has done no work that would make their presence sustainable beyond however long it takes, for intimacy to trigger their defensive withdrawal again. The patterns tell you everything you need to know about whether the avoidant is worth reconsidering or whether their return is just another cycle in dynamic that will continue repeating until you refuse to participate. Most importantly, recognizing these patterns allows you to make informed choice about how to respond when the avoidant faces you after silence. You can choose to require the accountability, vulnerability, and evidence of genuine change that healthy reconnection demands, understanding that the avoidant who cannot provide these things is revealing their unchanged capacity and saving you from being abandoned again when you finally allow yourself to trust them. You can choose to protect yourself from dynamic that requires your self-abandonment, to maintain boundaries that honor your worth, to refuse to re-enter relationship with someone who has demonstrated they are not capable of sustaining the intimacy you deserve. The avoidant will continue facing people after long silences, as long as people continue accepting their returns without requiring genuine transformation. Your choice to require transformation or maintain distance is your choice to break cycle for yourself, to refuse to enable dysfunction that destroys you while allowing the avoidant to continue avoiding the work their patterns require. What happens every single time the avoidant faces you after silence is revelation of who they actually are beneath the potential you want to believe in. And believing that revelation, rather than the story they want you to accept, is the choice that protects you from wasting more of your life, hoping they will become someone they have shown you clearly they are not. Why? The silence never creates the change. You hope it will. One of the most persistent hopes people maintain about avoidance is that extended silence will create space for reflection and growth. That time apart will allow the avoidant to recognize their patterns and do the work necessary to transform them. That absence will make them realize what they lost and motivate them to become capable of sustaining what they previously destroyed through their inability to show up. This hope is understandable, but almost always disappointed, because silence alone does not create change in people whose entire psychology is organized around avoiding the discomfort that genuine change requires. The avoidant experiences silence differently than you experience it. Where you might use separation as the opportunity for reflection, for examining your patterns, for considering how you contributed to relationship dysfunction and what you need to change, the avoidant uses silence primarily for regulation. The distance allows their nervous system to settle from the anxiety that intimacy activated, allows them to return to baseline where they feel safe and in control, allows them to avoid the discomfort of facing their limitations or sitting with the damage their patterns cause. The silence is not reflective space. It is protective distance from feelings they cannot tolerate. During the silence, the avoidant is not doing therapeutic work unless they have actively chosen to seek therapy and commit to addressing their attachment wounds. They are not journaling about their patterns, not reading about attachment theory, not practicing vulnerability in safe contexts, not developing the skills that sustainable intimacy requires. They are simply living their life with less anxiety than they experienced when intimacy with you was triggering their defensive system, enjoying the relief that distance provides from the demands that genuine relationship places on their limited capacity. The avoidant may think about you during the silence, may miss you, may even recognize that their patterns are problematic. But thinking and recognizing are not the same as doing the actual work of transformation. The avoidant can acknowledge their patterns while doing nothing to change them, can miss you while remaining completely unchanged in their capacity to show up for you, can recognize relationship matters while being no more capable of sustaining it than they were before the silence began. Awareness without action is not growth. It is simply more comfortable version of the same dysfunction. This is why the avoidant who faces you after long silence almost never demonstrates genuine transformation. The silence did not create change because the silence was not used for change. It was used for regulation, for escape from discomfort, for restoration of equilibrium that intimacy disrupted. The avoidant returns when distance has made approaching you feel manageable again, when they need what you provided enough that seeking you out feels worth the discomfort it will generate, when their nervous system has regulated enough that they can tolerate proximity, until intimacy triggers their defenses and they need to create distance again. Your hope that silence created change is understandable, because you are projecting how you would use that time onto someone whose psychology functions completely differently than yours. You would use reflection and growth opportunities because you are capable of sitting with discomfort that growth requires, because you can tolerate examining your flaws without your ego shattering, because you have capacity to change behavior even when change feels difficult. The avoidant lacks these capacities without therapeutic interventions specifically designed to develop them, and silence alone provides no such intervention. Accepting that silence creates no change protects you from the hope that keeps you engaging with someone whose return represents no genuine progress toward capacity for intimacy you need them to have. The avoidant facing you after silence is the same person who left, with the same limitations, the same patterns, the same defensive system that will cause them to leave again when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. The silence changed nothing except giving their nervous system the break it needed to tolerate approaching you again. The cost of accepting their return without requiring genuine transformation. When you accept the avoidant's return after silence without requiring concrete evidence of genuine transformation, you are choosing to participate in a cycle that will cause you increasing damage each time it repeats. The first abandonment hurts, but you can tell yourself it was a mistake, that they did not understand what they were doing, that it will not happen again. The second abandonment after you took them back confirms the pattern and damages your ability to trust not just them, but your own judgment about who deserves your investment. The third and subsequent abandonments destroy your sense of self, erode your boundaries, teach you that your needs do not matter, and that love means accepting treatment that violates your worth. Each cycle of the avoidant, leaving and returning without genuine change, reinforces both your patterns and theirs. You learn that your boundaries are negotiable, that your needs can be perpetually postponed, that you should accept breadcrumbs of intimacy rather than requiring consistent emotional availability. You learn that love means suffering, that caring about someone means tolerating behavior that harms you, that being a good partner means making endless allowances for someone who makes no equivalent allowances for you. These lessons damage your capacity for healthy relationship by teaching you to normalize dysfunction and pathologize your own very reasonable needs for consistency and reciprocity. The avoidant learns equally destructive lessons from your acceptance of their returns without requiring transformation. They learn that their patterns have no real consequences, that they can abandon people and return at will without doing any work to address what drove the abandonment. That apology or expression of regret is sufficient repair regardless of whether behavioral change follows. They learn that people will always take them back, that their limitations will always be accommodated, that they never have to do the uncomfortable work of genuine growth, because someone will always accept them exactly as they are, no matter how destructive their patterns prove to be. Your acceptance of their return enables their avoidance in the most literal sense. By allowing reconnection without requiring evidence of change, you remove the one consequence that might motivate them to seek help. The consequence of losing people who matter because their patterns make sustaining connection impossible. You become part of the system that keeps them sick, that allows them to continue operating as they always have, that prevents the crisis that could potentially drive them toward the therapeutic intervention their attachment wounds require. The cost to you compounds over time. Each abandonment damages trust a bit more, erodes self-worth a bit further, normalizes treatment that should be unacceptable a bit more thoroughly. You find yourself unable to enforce boundaries in other relationships because you have trained yourself that boundaries are obstacles rather than protection. You struggle to recognize healthy relationship when you encounter it because you have become so adapted to dysfunction that consistency and reciprocity feel boring or suffocating. You lose years to hoping someone will change while that hope prevents you from building life with someone actually capable of showing up. The cost to the avoidant is equally devastating even if they never recognize it. They lose opportunity after opportunity for genuine intimacy because they never develop capacity to sustain it. They destroy relationship after relationship through the same patterns while never facing that. The patterns are the problem rather than the specific people or circumstances. They die having experienced only the shallow pseudo-intimacy their defenses permit, never knowing what it feels like to be truly known and loved for who they actually are rather than who they perform being during the brief periods when distance makes proximity tolerable. Refusing to accept their return without requiring genuine transformation is the only choice that serves both people. It protects you from continued damage while creating the consequence that might motivate them to finally seek help. It honors your worth while giving them opportunity to develop capacity they currently lack. It breaks a cycle that destroys everyone it touches while opening possibility for genuine change if they ever become willing to do the work that change requires. How to respond when the avoidant faces you after silence. Knowing what happens every single time gives you framework for responding when the avoidant faces you after silence in ways that protect your well-being while maintaining appropriate boundaries around someone who has demonstrated they cannot sustain intimacy without genuine work on their patterns. Your response should be calibrated to what they demonstrate rather than what they promise, to evidence of actual change rather than expressions of desire to change, to their capacity shown through behavior rather than potential you want to believe exists beneath their defenses. First, refuse to accept framing that obscures their agency in creating the silence. When they suggest the distance was mutual or circumstantial, correct them clearly and without anger. They chose to disappear. Their choice was abandonment, regardless of what they were dealing with at the time. The silence was their creation and their responsibility. Establishing this truth is foundation for any genuine accountability that might follow. The avoidant who cannot accept this basic reality is revealing immediately that they have done no work on their patterns. Second, require them to answer specifically what has changed that would prevent pattern from repeating. Do not accept vague generalities about having time to think or understanding themselves better. Require concrete information about therapeutic work they have done, specific patterns they have addressed, behavioral changes they can demonstrate, ongoing commitment to continued growth. The avoidant who cannot provide this information is telling you clearly that nothing has changed and that reconnecting means entering the same cycle that ended with them abandoning you. Third, maintain boundaries that reflect the current state of broken trust rather than historical intimacy that existed before they disappeared. They do not have automatic right to the access and availability you provided before they chose to abandon you. They must earn trust back through sustained consistent behavior over time, must accept that you will be appropriately guarded until their actions prove they will not disappear again, must understand that immediate intimacy is not reasonable expectation after they destroyed a foundation that intimacy requires. Fourth, refuse to take responsibility for their discomfort with your very reasonable hesitation about reconnecting. Your caution is earned response to their demonstrated unreliability. Your boundaries are appropriate protection rather than obstacles they need to overcome. Your guardedness is their work to address through consistent behavior, rather than your work to eliminate based on nothing but their desire for you to trust them. The avoidant who frames your protection as the problem is revealing they have learned nothing, and they expect you to enable their patterns by eliminating boundaries that would require them to show up differently. Finally, be willing to maintain distance if they cannot meet these requirements. The avoidant who cannot take accountability, cannot identify what has changed, cannot accept appropriate boundaries, cannot tolerate your reasonable hesitation is demonstrating clearly that they are not ready for genuine relationship, and that reconnecting would mean repeating cycle that ended with them abandoning you. Your willingness to walk away from someone you care about because they cannot meet reasonable requirements for reconnection is your commitment to protecting yourself from patterns that will destroy you if you continue participating in them. The truth about whether they will ever change. The question that haunts people dealing with avoidant who faces them after silence is whether the avoidant will ever genuinely change. Whether the patterns that drove their abandonment can be transformed through therapeutic work. Whether hope that they could become capable of sustained intimacy is realistic or simply fantasy that prevents you from accepting who they actually are. The answer is complicated because change is theoretically possible, but practically rare, requiring sustained commitment that most avoidants never demonstrate. Avoidant attachment patterns can be transformed through intensive therapeutic work specifically targeting the childhood wounds that created the defensive system. The avoidant can learn to recognize when their nervous system is activating, can develop capacity to communicate about discomfort rather than disappearing, can practice vulnerability in controlled doses until it becomes more tolerable. can build skills for sustaining intimacy through the anxiety it generates, rather than needing to create distance every time closeness triggers their defenses. Transformation is possible, but it requires years of consistent therapeutic engagement that most avoidants are unwilling to commit to. The avoidant who genuinely transforms typically does so only after experiencing consequences severe enough that continuing their patterns becomes more painful than doing the work to change them. They lose someone who truly mattered in ways that make them unable to continue believing. Their patterns are fine. They face that they are destroying every relationship they attempt through the same defensive behaviors. They recognize that they will die alone if they cannot develop capacity for intimacy their nervous system currently cannot tolerate. The transformation happens not because they suddenly want to be different, but because the pain of staying the same finally exceeds the terror of genuine change. Most avoidants never reach this point because people keep accepting their returns without requiring transformation, keep accommodating their patterns instead of enforcing consequences, keep enabling their avoidance by doing all the work of maintaining connection, while the avoidant does nothing to address their limitations. The avoidant who can abandon people and return at will without doing any therapeutic work has no motivation to change because the consequences of their patterns are being absorbed by others rather than felt by themselves. This is why your choice about how to respond when the avoidant faces you after silence matters not just for you but potentially for them. By refusing to reconnect without evidence of genuine change, you create consequence that might be the catalyst they need to finally seek help. By maintaining boundaries that require them to show up differently, you eliminate the enabling that has allowed them to continue avoiding the work their patterns require. By choosing yourself over hope, they might change, you demonstrate that their patterns have real costs they can no longer avoid by finding another person willing to accommodate what you no longer will. Whether they actually use your boundaries as motivation for change is completely outside your control and not your responsibility. Most will simply move on, seeking someone else willing to play the role you refused to continue playing. But occasionally, losing someone who mattered because of patterns they could change if they were willing to do the work creates the crisis that drives them toward genuine transformation. Your boundaries create possibility for their growth, even if that growth never materializes. And more importantly, your boundaries protect you from being destroyed by patterns they may never address, regardless of how much potential you believe exists beneath their defenses.